I am Calvin Pierce, 68 years old, and I recently learned that the cost of a son's loyalty is exactly $3,000 a month. After a devastating car accident left me pinned in a hospital bed, my son and his wife stood over me, not to offer comfort, but to complain that my shattered leg was inconveniently timed for their luxury vacation. They told me to figure it out myself and walked away. I simply smiled, reached for my phone, and severed their financial lifeline forever. What I discovered next changed everything. Before I reveal the full depth of their betrayal, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect should be earned, not bought. The rhythmic mechanical beep of the heart monitor was the only sound tethering me to reality. A heavy steel traction halo pinned my right leg, suspending it above the crisp, white hospital sheets. Every single breath felt like inhaling crushed glass. It was a stark, agonizing reminder of the heavy steering column that had collapsed against my ribs hours earlier. The freezing downpour of a bleak Tuesday night had turned the interstate into a sheet of black ice. I had been driving through that blinding storm for one specific reason. My son Brandon had demanded I deliver his forgotten corporate tax documents to his accountant before the midnight deadline. He had claimed he was too busy networking at a cocktail lounge to handle his own legal responsibilities. I had risked my life to save him from an audit. The memory of the blinding headlights from the oncoming truck and the terrifying crushing impact was suddenly interrupted by the violent swinging of my hospital room door. Brandon walked into the room wearing a pristine, perfectly tailored suit. He was completely unmarked by the brutal weather outside and entirely devoid of any visible concern. His wife, Madison, trailed closely behind him, aggressively tapping the screen of her expensive smartphone with her manicured nails. They did not rush to my bedside. They did not ask if I was in pain or what the trauma surgeons had concluded. Brandon stopped at the foot of my bed, let out a loud, heavily irritated sigh, and immediately complained that the hospital parking garage was an absolute extortion racket. He claimed it was ridiculous to pay $20 just to visit a sick relative. Madison chimed in without looking up from her screen, stating bitterly that the valet had scuffed her new designer shoes on the wet pavement. I stared at the two of them through the haze of heavy painkillers. The narcotics did absolutely nothing to numb the sudden, sharp realization of who I had raised. I had almost died on a frozen highway running an errand he was too lazy to complete, and his primary concern was a trivial parking fee. Before I could formulate a response to their staggering selfishness, the attending physician walked into the room holding a thick metal clipboard. He reviewed my complex medical charts and delivered the prognosis with grim clinical precision. I had suffered a severe compound fracture of the femur, 3 broken ribs, and a significant concussion. The doctor looked directly at Brandon and explained in clear terms that I would require round-the-clock continuous medical care for a minimum of 6 weeks upon discharge. I would need physical assistance bathing, preparing meals, and managing a highly complex medication schedule to prevent blood clots. Brandon scoffed loudly. The sound echoed harshly against the sterile walls of the recovery room. Madison loudly snapped her designer watch against her wrist, checking the time with theatrical impatience. Brandon stepped closer to my bed, his face completely devoid of empathy or familial obligation. He delivered his decree without a single trace of hesitation or guilt. He stated clearly that they were leaving for a first-class trip to Tulum in exactly 3 hours. He emphasized that they held non-refundable reservations at an exclusive luxury resort. He looked down at my shattered body and declared that they were absolutely not canceling their vacation plans for this inconvenience. He told me I was a grown man and that I needed to figure out a solution entirely on my own. He looked me right in the eye and said they could not take care of me because their vacation came first. The hospital room fell completely silent. The attending doctor looked thoroughly appalled, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. But Brandon simply turned his back to me. Madison did not even bother to look up from her phone as she followed her husband out the door. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, sealing my physical abandonment with a hollow thud. I lay there in the quiet room, listening to the steady beep of my failing heart. The doctor awkwardly offered a sympathetic apology for my family's behavior, but I raised my unbroken hand to stop him. A strange, incredibly powerful sensation washed over my bruised body. I did not weep. I did not feel the crushing weight of sorrow that a father should feel when discarded by his only child. Instead, my lips curved upward. I smiled. It was a cold, hardened expression born from absolute clarity. The heavy veil of my own deliberate denial had finally been lifted. I realized I had spent the last decade funding the arrogance of monsters. I pressed the red call button attached to my bedrail and asked the attending physician for the direct contact information of the absolute best private duty nurse the hospital could recommend. Within 20 minutes, I had secured the services of Nurse Diana Cole, paying her premium weekly retainer entirely out of pocket without a second thought. My survival was no longer dependent on my son's non-existent mercy or basic humanity. Once the private medical arrangements were finalized, I picked up my phone from the bedside table and opened my mobile banking application. For years, I had justified my endless financial indulgence, telling myself I was simply helping my boy find his footing in a difficult world. With a single deliberate tap on the glowing screen, I canceled the automatic $3,000 monthly transfer that seamlessly funded Brandon and Madison's lavish, unearned lifestyle. The banking server processed the request instantly. The account immediately registered the permanent change. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of liberation washing through my veins. But as I reviewed the main financial dashboard to verify my balances, my eyes caught a strange, glaring anomaly on a secondary credit line I kept strictly for major household emergencies. There was a newly authorized pending charge for exactly $15,000. I stared at the bold numbers, my pulse quickening against the rhythm of the medical monitor. Brandon had not just abandoned me to suffer alone in a hospital bed. The betrayal ran far deeper than a monthly allowance, and the silent adjustment of my legacy had just officially begun. 48 hours passed before I saw the inside of my own home again. The transition from the sterile hospital ward to my familiar bedroom was agonizingly slow. It was managed entirely by the quiet competence of Nurse Diana Cole. She had transformed my ground floor study into a makeshift medical recovery room. She moved my heavy mahogany bed downstairs so I would not have to navigate the staircase. The scent of antiseptic now mingled with the familiar smell of old leather books and lemon polish. My shattered leg remained elevated and immobilized within a heavy metal traction device. The pain was a constant, dull roar behind my eyes. It was barely managed by the strict medication schedule Diana meticulously maintained. Outside my window, the winter storm had finally broken. It left behind a brittle, frozen landscape that mirrored the profound coldness settling deep within my own chest. I lay against the pillows, staring at the intricate plaster molding on the ceiling. I had spent 50 years building this sanctuary. I filled it with warmth and security for a family I thought I knew. Now it felt like an operational headquarters for a war I had never intended to fight. The silence of the house was absolute. It was broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was a peaceful silence. It was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I knew I had just unleashed 2,000 miles away. The peace was abruptly shattered by the relentless buzzing vibration of my smartphone resting on the bedside table. I did not immediately reach for it. I simply turned my head and watched the glowing screen illuminate the dim room. The caller identification displayed a name I had spent 34 years loving unconditionally. It was Brandon. The phone vibrated violently against the wood. It stopped for precisely 3 seconds and then immediately began vibrating again. He was speed dialing. I let it ring. I watched the digital counter of missed calls climb steadily upward. 10. 25. 50. By the time the screen finally rested on the number 95, a dark, undeniable satisfaction began to replace the lingering sorrow in my heart. I knew exactly what was happening on the sun-drenched coast of Tulum. The automated banking alerts on my own tablet had already painted a very clear picture of his escalating panic. He had attempted to authorize a $5,000 charge at an exclusive beach club. It was declined. He had attempted to process a $2,000 transaction at a luxury resort spa. It was declined. He had even attempted to pull cash from an international automatic teller machine. It was denied due to insufficient funds. The financial safety net he had taken for granted his entire adult life had simply vanished into thin air. He was stranded in a foreign country surrounded by opulence he could no longer afford. He was forced to face the humiliating reality of his own empty pockets. I asked Diana to hand me the device. Her eyes flickered with silent concern, but she remained professional. She placed the heavy phone into my palm before stepping out of the room to prepare my evening meals. I unlocked the screen and navigated to my voicemail inbox. There were 14 new messages. I pressed play on the most recent recording. I needed to hear his voice. I needed to know if there was even a fraction of genuine concern for my physical well-being buried beneath his sudden financial crisis. The audio crackled, filling the quiet study with the frantic, high-pitched sound of my son losing his mind. He did not ask if I was alive. He did not ask if the trauma surgeons had managed to save my leg from amputation. His voice was breathless and panicked. It was dripping with intense entitlement. He demanded to know why his platinum card was suddenly rejecting a mandatory resort fee. He screamed into the receiver, ordering me to call my bank representative immediately. He commanded me to fix what he assumed was a stupid clerical error on my part. In the background of the recording, I could hear Madison crying hysterically. She was loudly complaining that the hotel management was threatening to lock them out of their penthouse suite. The recording ended with a string of vicious curses directed entirely at me. I sat completely still, letting the heavy silence rush back into the room. The very last remnants of my paternal guilt evaporated into nothing. It left behind a cold, calculated resolve. I did not feel the urge to call him back and explain his punishment. I did not want to hear his desperate excuses or his sudden, insincere apologies once he realized I held all the power. Engaging in a screaming match across international lines would only give him an emotional outlet. It would allow him to cast himself as the victim of a massive misunderstanding. I refused to give him that comfort. I pressed my thumb against his contact profile and selected the option to block the number completely. I repeated the exact same process for Madison. The digital barricade was instantly erected. They were completely cut off from my world. Silence was no longer just the absence of noise. It had become my very first weapon in this new reality. It was a suffocating, impenetrable wall that would force them to sit with the terrifying consequences of their own arrogance. They had abandoned me in a hospital to figure it out myself. Now they were being granted that exact same opportunity in a foreign land. I placed the phone face down on the bedside table. I needed to conserve my physical energy for the real battle approaching. Cutting his monthly allowance was merely a flesh wound. I needed to amputate the financial infection entirely. I looked toward the doorway as Diana returned carrying a tray with my next round of medication. I swallowed the bitter pills with a sip of water. I looked up at my nurse and asked her to retrieve my heavy leather-bound legal directories from the top drawer of my desk. It was time to summon the architect of my ultimate retaliation. The heavy brass knocker on my front door sounded exactly at 9 o'clock the following morning. Nurse Diana answered it, ushering a tall man in a charcoal pinstripe suit out of the winter chill and into my makeshift recovery room. Aaron Foster did not bring flowers or offer sympathetic platitudes regarding my shattered leg. He was not that kind of lawyer. I had retained Aaron precisely because he possessed the emotional warmth of a surgical scalpel. He was a ruthless estate and corporate attorney who viewed family dynamics strictly through the lens of liability leverage and legal consequence. He walked into my study, set a heavy black leather briefcase onto my antique dining table, and unbuttoned his suit jacket. He looked at the heavy steel traction halo pinning my leg to the bed and gave a single curt nod of acknowledgement before unlocking his briefcase. We did not waste any time on pleasantries. I had paid him a substantial premium retainer to skip the condolences and proceed directly to the execution of my will. Within 10 minutes, my quiet, comfortable study was completely transformed into a tactical legal war room. Aaron connected his heavily encrypted laptop to my secure home network and spread a series of thick manila folders across the polished mahogany surface. The warm light of this brass reading lamp illuminated massive stacks of banking statements, corporate tax filings, and complex legal contracts. We were about to perform a ruthless forensic autopsy on my son's entire financial existence. I sat upright in my medical bed, completely ignoring the throbbing pain radiating from my fractured femur. I directed Aaron to access the primary financial server using my master credentials. For years, I had maintained joint access to Brandon's foundational accounts. This was a strict condition of the initial seed money I had provided him immediately after he graduated from college. He had always deeply resented this oversight, complaining loudly and often about my apparent lack of trust in his abilities. However, he had never bothered to hire his own independent accountant to officially sever the connection and establish his own financial independence. His sheer laziness and reliance on my infrastructure was now my greatest tactical advantage. Aaron's long fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing security protocols and pulling up the current financial ledgers. The glowing screen reflected a catastrophic reality. Brandon was actively bleeding money from every possible avenue. Without the $3,000 monthly infusion I had just permanently terminated, his personal checking account was completely hollowed out. Aaron clicked through the recent transaction history, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. We watched the digital footprint of a man living entirely outside of his actual reality. There were exorbitant charges for leased luxury vehicles, he did not own exclusive golf club memberships he barely used, and bespoke tailoring from high-end boutiques. All of this was funded by lines of credit, stretched dangerously close to their absolute maximum limits. The lavish Tulum vacation had been the final fatal weight placed upon a rapidly crumbling bridge. He was entirely dependent on my silent capital to maintain his grand illusion of success. Aaron closed the personal banking window and opened a heavily encrypted corporate file folder. This was the true battlefield. 5 years ago, Brandon had come to me with a seemingly brilliant pitch for a global logistics software startup. He had the natural charisma and the advanced technical vocabulary, but he lacked a single dollar of actual capital. He had begged me to fund the venture, promising massive returns and generational wealth. I agreed to help him liquidating a significant portion of my own retirement portfolio to give him his dream. However, even back then, I recognized his fatal character flaw. Brandon possessed soaring, limitless ambition, but absolutely zero operational discipline. To protect my massive investment and to safeguard my late wife's financial legacy, I had my legal counsel draft a very specific, heavily guarded operating agreement. I provided the entire $2 million seed funding, but I structured the corporate entity so that I retained a 51% silent majority share. I was the absolute controlling entity of his entire corporation. Brandon had eagerly signed the massive stack of paperwork on my desk without ever bothering to read the dense legal terminology buried on the 4th page. Over the past 5 years, as the startup gained modest traction in the industry and his personal ego inflated to dangerous levels, he had completely convinced himself that he was a brilliant self-made man. His profound arrogance had caused him to entirely forget the structural reality of his own company. He truly believed he was the sole untouchable king of his castle. Aaron handed me a freshly printed copy of that original operating agreement. The heavy parchment paper felt substantial and powerful in my hands. The critical legal clauses were highlighted in bright yellow ink. Aaron adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked at me with a predatory stillness. He explained the precise, devastating nature of our current leverage. Because I officially held the majority stake, I possessed the unilateral legal authority to freeze all corporate assets pending a comprehensive financial review. Furthermore, if we could prove that Brandon had been commingling corporate funds to sustain his lavish personal lifestyle, I had the absolute right to terminate his position as Chief Executive Officer immediately. I looked at the digital bank statements glowing brightly on the laptop screen. It took Aaron exactly 4 minutes to find the undeniable proof we needed. Brandon had actively used the corporate expense account to pay for the private jet charter to Tulum. It was a direct, undeniable breach of his fiduciary duty to the company. He had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire kingdom. The agonizing pain in my shattered leg completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a massive surge of cold, highly focused adrenaline. I leaned forward and instructed Aaron to prepare the necessary legal injunctions immediately. I wanted the corporate accounts locked down so tightly that Brandon would not be able to buy a cup of coffee with company money. Aaron nodded slowly, his fingers resuming their rapid rhythmic strike against the laptop keys. He warned me that this specific legal action would trigger an immediate automated alert on Brandon's mobile phone down in Mexico. He explicitly warned me that cutting off the personal monthly allowance was merely a slap in the face, but freezing the corporate accounts was an act of total, undeniable war. I looked Aaron directly in the eye and told him I was well aware of the distinction. I reminded my attorney that my son had left me broken and bleeding in a hospital bed because my basic physical survival was inconvenient to his tropical vacation schedule. I stated clearly that there would be no mercy. There would be no second chances or emotional reconciliations. The time for gentle parenting and endless financial safety nets had expired the exact moment he walked out of that hospital room. We spent the next 3 hours meticulously documenting every single unauthorized corporate withdrawal and flagrant personal expense. We built an impenetrable fortress of financial evidence. Aaron rapidly drafted a formal notice of an emergency shareholder meeting. It was a meeting consisting entirely of me gathering to vote on the immediate permanent suspension of the chief executive officer. We were not merely pulling the financial rug out from under him. We were detonating the entire foundation of his fraudulent life. The late afternoon winter sun cast long, heavy shadows across the polished hardwood floor of my living room as Nurse Diana carefully rearranged the heavy antique furniture. My sudden transition to a customized medical wheelchair required precise spatial adjustments throughout the entire ground floor of the estate. She meticulously rolled the thick Persian rugs out of the way and shifted the heavy oak side tables against the far walls to create wide, clear pathways for my wheels. The physical space of my home was visibly altering to accommodate my broken body and my new, restricted reality. She worked with quiet, professional efficiency near the grand bay windows overlooking the frozen garden. Suddenly, she paused her labor and stood completely still. She was standing directly before the massive cherry wood display cabinet that dominated the entire eastern wall of the room. This towering cabinet with its curved glass doors had been my late wife Beatrice's absolute pride and joy. It housed her meticulously curated collection of 18th century sterling silver and rare imported porcelain. Beatrice had spent 3 decades attending high-end estate sales and exclusive private auctions across the world to build that magnificent collection. Every single piece inside was carefully catalogued with a small, discreet ivory inventory tag attached to its velvet base. Diana turned toward me with a slight frown of genuine confusion pulling at her features. She pointed out that several of the staggered velvet display shelves were completely bare. She noted that the remaining silver serving trays and porcelain teacups had been awkwardly rearranged and spread far apart, as if someone had deliberately tried to hide the empty spaces. She quietly asked if I had recently sent the missing centerpiece items away for professional polishing or restoration. A sudden heavy coldness settled deep within my chest, radiating outward from my bruised ribs. I had not opened those curved glass doors or moved a single silver item in that cabinet since the day Beatrice passed away. It was a completely untouched, sacred shrine to her memory. I asked Diana to bring me my high-speed laptop immediately. I balanced the heavy computer carefully on my uninjured leg and quickly accessed the central administrative control panel for my comprehensive home security system. I had installed the high-definition motion-activated cameras 2 years ago primarily to monitor the exterior doors and the main living areas for my own safety as I lived alone. I navigated directly to the archived video logs and began scanning the digital timestamps from the past 3 months. I focused my targeted search entirely on the mid-morning hours when I was routinely at my corporate office downtown. The digital timeline scrolled past in a rapid blur of empty rooms and static shadows until I spotted a massive, glaring anomaly. It was recorded exactly 3 weeks before my devastating highway accident. I clicked the compressed video file and expanded it to fill the entire laptop screen. The crystal-clear high-resolution footage revealed my daughter-in-law Madison casually unlocking my solid oak front door. She did not look like a concerned family member dropping by to check on her elderly father-in-law. She was dressed elegantly in an expensive designer trench coat and holding a limited-edition leather handbag. She stepped aside and casually held my front door open for 2 strange men dressed in sharp, dark business suits. They were carrying heavy padded transit boxes and professional photography lighting equipment. I watched in absolute frozen silence as Madison confidently led the unknown men directly into my living room and pointed straight toward Beatrice's cherry wood cabinet. The men efficiently put on white cotton inspection gloves and began meticulously examining the silver teapots and the rare porcelain vases. Madison stood casually behind them, scrolling through her mobile phone with utter boredom. She occasionally pointed her manicured finger to specific high-value items on the upper shelves. She was openly directing an illegal professional appraisal inside my own private home, while I was sitting completely oblivious at my office desk across town. The silent video showed the men carefully wrapping 6 of Beatrice's most valuable antique silver pieces and a completely irreplaceable imported porcelain vase. They placed the wrapped treasures gently into their padded transit boxes. Madison handed one of the men a signed piece of paper, and they walked out my front door together. She had systematically and coldly robbed my dead wife's shrine to fund her endless pursuit of superficial luxury. The profound, undeniable violation of my safe sanctuary and Beatrice's beautiful memory made the agonizing physical pain in my shattered leg feel entirely insignificant. I immediately contacted my attorney, Aaron Foster, and instructed him to return to my home. When he arrived, I showed him the security footage and instructed him to aggressively cross-reference the exact date and time of the video with Brandon and Madison's detailed financial records. Aaron accessed his heavily encrypted legal files and ruthlessly traced their banking activity from that specific Tuesday afternoon. The forensic financial results were devastatingly precise and undeniable. Within 4 hours of those appraisers leaving my home with Beatrice's treasures, a wire transfer of exactly $18,000 had been deposited directly into Madison's private checking account. The source of the incoming funds was a highly exclusive private auction house located in the wealthy financial district of the city. She had quietly and illegally liquidated my late wife's irreplaceable family heirlooms and immediately spent the massive profits. Aaron tracked the outgoing money trail, showing she had purchased a custom diamond tennis bracelet and placed a massive, non-refundable deposit for an upcoming luxury wellness retreat in the mountains. She treated my beloved home as her own personal warehouse of disposable wealth. But the horrifying financial discoveries did not stop with the stolen silver collection. Aaron continued digging relentlessly into the deep, complex financial architecture of Madison's recent digital activities. He focused his intense legal scrutiny to isolate the mysterious $15,000 pending charge I had previously noticed on my secondary emergency credit line. I had initially assumed Brandon had simply stolen those specific credit card numbers to pay for his lavish Tulum resort fees. The actual reality was infinitely more calculated and incredibly cruel. Aaron meticulously traced the specific merchant identification number attached to that massive $15,000 charge. It linked directly back to a specialized heavy freight logistics company. They were an elite insured moving service dedicated entirely to the safe, delicate transport of grand musical instruments and museum-quality furniture. Aaron opened a newly acquired electronic document from his secure server and slowly turned his laptop screen toward my bed so I could read the bold black print. It was a digital invoice and a legally binding contract of transport and sale. Madison had brazenly used my own emergency credit line to pay the massive non-refundable logistics deposit for an upcoming high-stakes private auction. She had digitally forged my legal signature on the financial authorization forms to bypass the bank security protocols. The specific item listed for heavy transport and international sale was Beatrice's vintage mahogany grand piano. That beautiful piano was the literal beating heart and centerpiece of our home. It was the magnificent instrument my wife had played every single evening for over 40 years, filling these walls with warmth and music. Madison had officially scheduled the heavy freight movers to arrive at my house next Wednesday morning. She fully intended to have the massive piano forcibly removed from my living room and sold to an anonymous overseas collector, while I was supposedly trapped in a hospital bed recovering from my shattered leg. She believed I would be completely out of the way, heavily medicated on narcotics, and entirely incapable of stopping her elaborate scheme. She thought she had flawlessly orchestrated the perfect silent robbery of my entire estate. The sheer breathtaking audacity of her plan was staggering to witness. She was not merely draining my bank accounts to buy designer clothes. She was actively and maliciously erasing every physical trace of the beautiful woman I loved, just to subsidize her own empty vanity. She was literally selling my heart piece by piece to the highest bidder. I closed Aaron's laptop very slowly and handed it back to him. The simmering anger inside me instantly solidified into something incredibly cold, hard, and infinitely dangerous. The $15,000 logistics charge was no longer a confusing financial mystery. It was a loud ticking clock counting down to total war. The illegal private piano auction was scheduled to occur in exactly 1 week. Madison had unknowingly provided me with the exact date, time, and location of her own absolute destruction. I looked at Aaron and instructed him to contact the private auction house immediately. We were absolutely not going to cancel the logistics transport or stop the heavy movers from arriving. We were going to prepare the ground and let the steel trap snap completely shut around her. The tropical sun of the Mexican coast beat down relentlessly against the open-air marble lobby of the Azure Riviera Resort. The air was thick with the scent of sea salt and expensive coconut sunscreen. Brandon stood at the polished mahogany concierge desk wearing a pristine white linen shirt and designer sunglasses. He looked entirely out of place for a man whose father had nearly died in a mangled car wreck just 48 hours prior. He was holding a crystal glass of iced lime water in one hand and casually tapping his solid metal platinum credit card against the counter with the other. Madison stood beside him, completely absorbed in her mobile phone, editing a photograph of her morning poolside breakfast for her social media followers. They had spent the last 2 days living like absolute royalty. They had rented a private beachfront cabana, ordered imported vintage tequila, and scheduled intensive deep tissue massages to help them recover from the stressful inconvenience of my highway accident. They had racked up an incidental room charge of nearly $9,000 in a single weekend. Brandon was fully confident that the automatic $3,000 transfer from my checking account had already cleared that morning. He believed that money combined with his massive personal credit limits would easily cover the exorbitant lifestyle he felt he rightfully deserved. The impeccably dressed concierge smiled politely and accepted the heavy metal card from Brandon. He slid the magnetic strip through the high-end point of sale terminal. Brandon took a sip of his water completely unconcerned. He was already planning their dinner reservations at the exclusive underwater restaurant down the coast. The sleek digital machine processed the information for exactly 3 seconds before emitting a harsh, flat electronic tone. A bright red error message flashed across the small screen. The concierge maintained his professional smile, but his eyes hardened slightly. He handed the card back and politely informed Brandon that the financial institution had declined the transaction. Brandon scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes in exaggerated annoyance. He confidently told the clerk that his bank was simply being overly cautious regarding international travel charges. He reached into his leather wallet and pulled out a secondary gold credit card. He slapped it onto the marble counter with a heavy sigh, complaining about the massive inconvenience of fraud protection algorithms. The concierge swiped the second card. The machine beeped again. It was the exact same harsh tone of absolute rejection. Madison finally looked up from her phone. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of deep irritation. She loudly asked Brandon why he was embarrassing her in front of the other wealthy guests waiting in the lobby. Brandon ignored her. A small bead of sweat formed at his temple despite the cool ocean breeze flowing through the open architecture. He quickly pulled out his mobile phone and opened his personal banking application. He navigated directly to his primary checking account, expecting to see the comfortable cushion of my monthly financial infusion. The screen loaded instantly. The available balance displayed was exactly $14.32. The $3,000 automatic transfer had simply vanished. There was no pending transaction and no notification of a delay. The money he had relied on his entire adult life had been surgically removed from his existence. Brandon stared at the glaring numbers, his mind struggling to comprehend the impossible reality. He refreshed the application 3 times, but the miserable single-digit balance remained completely unchanged. Before Brandon could formulate a coherent thought, the resort general manager stepped out from a private glass office behind the concierge desk. The manager was a tall, imposing man, wearing a tailored suit that projected absolute authority. He did not smile as he approached the counter. He spoke in a quiet, measured tone that carried the unmistakable weight of a final verdict. He informed Brandon that the resort accounting department had been trying to pre-authorize his payment methods since early that morning. He stated clearly that every single financial instrument attached to their guest profile had been entirely rejected by the global banking network. Because their outstanding balance for luxury services and imported alcohol had already exceeded the maximum allowable unsecured limit, the hotel was forced to enact their strict security protocol. The manager looked Brandon directly in the eye and calmly explained that their electronic room key cards had been permanently deactivated. Madison gasped loudly, dropping her phone into her expensive leather handbag. She took a step forward and demanded that the manager reactivate their suite immediately. She screamed that all of her custom designer clothing and her expensive diamond jewelry were locked inside the penthouse. She threatened to destroy the reputation of the resort online and promised to file a massive lawsuit for emotional distress. The manager did not flinch. He clasped his hands patiently behind his back and informed her that all personal belongings remaining in the suite had already been meticulously cataloged and secured by the private resort security team. He explained that their luggage was currently being held in a locked vault in the basement. They would not be allowed to access their clothing, their passports, or their return flight itineraries until the entire $9,000 balance was paid in full via a certified wire transfer or valid cash currency. They were officially locked out. They were stranded in the lobby, wearing nothing but their lightweight resort wear, with absolutely zero access to their previous lives. Other wealthy guests passing through the beautiful marble lobby began to stop and stare. The hushed whispers of the surrounding crowd felt like physical blows against Brandon's fragile ego. The public humiliation was absolute and instantaneous. Madison turned her furious gaze away from the resort manager and directed all of her venom entirely toward her husband. She shoved Brandon hard in the chest, demanding to know what he had done to her vacation. She ordered him to call his father right that second and force him to wire the money to the hotel. She shrieked that she absolutely refused to stand in a public lobby looking like a desperate beggar. Brandon could not look her in the eye. He spun around and practically ran out of the air-conditioned lobby into the oppressive, suffocating heat of the exterior courtyard. The tropical sun beat down on his shoulders as he frantically dialed my private cellular number. He paced back and forth across the stone patio, his hands shaking violently. He pressed the phone tight against his ear, desperate to hear my voice. He fully intended to scream at me and demand that I fix the banking error immediately. He waited for the familiar ringing tone. Instead, the line clicked once and instantly dropped to a flat, dead dial tone. He pulled the phone away from his face and stared at the screen in pure disbelief. He tried dialing the house landline. The result was exactly the same. He had been completely blocked. The realization hit him like a physical punch to the stomach. His father was not confused or experiencing a bank error. His father had intentionally, aggressively, and permanently cut him off. He was completely alone. Sheer survival panic finally shattered his arrogant facade. He needed access to massive liquid capital immediately, or they would be sleeping on the public beach. He leaned against a palm tree, gasping for air in the heavy humidity. He opened the highly secure corporate banking application on his phone. This was the master account for his entire logistics software startup. It held hundreds of thousands of dollars in operational capital and investor funds. He knew it was highly illegal to use corporate money to pay for a personal luxury vacation. He knew it was a direct violation of his fiduciary duty. But he rationalized the crime within seconds. He convinced himself that he was the brilliant chief executive officer, and he could simply categorize the massive withdrawal as an emergency executive wellness expense. He typed his secure administrative password into the digital prompt. His hands were sweating so profusely, he dropped the phone onto the grass. He snatched it back up and navigated to the primary wire transfer portal. He typed in the exact routing number for the Azure Riviera Resort and requested an immediate transfer of $15,000 to cover the current bill and secure their flights home. He took a deep breath and pressed the bright blue confirmation button on the screen. He waited for the familiar green checkmark to appear. He waited for the digital validation that would save him from total public ruin. The application buffered for one agonizing second. Then the screen flashed a brilliant, blinding red. A stark white warning message appeared across the display. Access denied. Corporate accounts frozen by order of the primary majority shareholder. Routine administrative privileges revoked pending formal legal audit. Brandon stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost standing in the bright Mexican sun. He furiously tapped the screen, trying to force the application to reload. The system immediately logged him out and locked his username. He was holding a dead device. He suddenly realized the terrifying scope of his reality. His father had not just canceled a monthly allowance. His father had systematically dismantled his entire financial existence while lying in a hospital bed. Brandon slid slowly down the rough trunk of the palm tree until he was sitting in the dirt. He was stranded thousands of miles from home, facing imminent arrest by the Mexican authorities for defrauding a luxury resort. His company was gone. His money was gone. And the silent adjustment of his life was only just beginning. The air in my study felt entirely different now. It was no longer the heavy, stagnant atmosphere of a quiet medical recovery room. It had become a highly focused command center. Aaron Foster sat across the polished mahogany table from me with his silver laptop open. His long fingers moved with precise, deliberate speed across the keyboard. He had spent the last 2 uninterrupted hours drafting the formal legal injunctions required to completely paralyze my son's logistics software company. I watched the heavy commercial printer in the corner of the room spring to life. It began spitting out thick pages of dense legal text. These were not simply pieces of paper. They were the absolute destruction of the false empire I had allowed Brandon to build. Aaron gathered the warm pages and aligned them perfectly before sliding them across the table toward my medical bed. He handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. He looked at me with a perfectly neutral expression and explained the immense gravity of the documents sitting before me. He told me that the moment my signature touched the paper, I would be officially exercising my absolute rights as the 51% majority shareholder. I would be initiating an emergency forensic corporate audit based on undeniable documented evidence of gross financial embezzlement. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I did not feel a single tremor of doubt in my hand. I took the pen and signed my name on the dotted line. The dark ink flowed smoothly across the page, securing the final nail in the coffin of Brandon's unearned financial independence. Aaron took the signed documents and immediately began scanning them into his secure private legal server. He explained the exact sequence of events that would follow this action. We were not simply asking the commercial bank to temporarily pause the accounts while we asked a few questions. We were executing a hostile financial lockdown of the entire corporate entity. Aaron transmitted the encrypted files directly to the corporate banking division with a high-priority federal legal flag. Within minutes, the massive financial institution complied with the legal mandate. The primary operational accounts for the logistics startup were instantly frozen solid. The massive payroll accounts holding the salaries of 50 innocent employees were locked. The vendor payment lines and the cloud server hosting fees were entirely severed. Every single dollar of corporate capital was now completely inaccessible to the chief executive officer. Aaron looked at his glowing screen and confirmed that the digital guillotine had dropped perfectly. He noted that Brandon had been running the software company dangerously close to complete insolvency anyway. The financial ledgers clearly showed that my son had been prioritizing his own lavish executive salary and expensive corporate retreats over basic operational stability. By locking the accounts, we were not just stopping his vacation spending spree. We were exposing a massive systemic failure in his daily leadership. The board of directors and the wealthy minority investors would be legally notified of the emergency audit within the hour. Brandon would not just return home broke. He would return home to face a firing squad of furious investors demanding to know exactly why their seed money was spent on Mexican beach resorts instead of software engineering and development. I sat back against my pillows and let out a long, slow breath. The physical pain radiating from my shattered leg was still present, but it was entirely overshadowed by the profound sense of control I had finally reclaimed. I knew that thousands of miles away on a sunny, humid beach in Tulum, a massive digital shockwave was about to hit my son. I imagined the exact moment his mobile phone would light up with the catastrophic banking alerts. I imagined the arrogant, entitled smirk wiping completely off his face as the terrifying reality of his situation crushed him. He had always thought he was completely untouchable. He had truly believed my paternal love was a permanent, unconditional shield against his own incompetence and cruelty. He was about to learn the hard way that my financial protection was a privilege he had violently discarded. The heavy silence in my study was finally broken by the soft electronic chime of Aaron's laptop. It was an automated confirmation receipt from the global banking network. The corporate lockdown was absolute and final. There was absolutely no way for Brandon to bypass the freeze or authorize a single penny without my direct notarized signature. While I sat in the quiet comfort of my heavily secured home, Brandon was experiencing the most terrifying free fall of his entire privileged life. Stripped of his heavy metal platinum credit cards and locked entirely out of his corporate wealth, he was rapidly reduced to a state of pure feral panic. The Mexican resort management had already confiscated their expensive luxury luggage and physically escorted them off the beautiful property. They were standing on the hot, dusty pavement of the main tourist thoroughfare with absolutely nothing but the lightweight resort clothes on their backs. Brandon knew he could not call me to fix the situation. He knew his mother-in-law would not answer her phone because Madison had already drained her retirement accounts months ago to buy a designer handbag. He was entirely out of viable options. The blistering afternoon sun beat down on his shoulders as he realized the true gravity of his isolation. But absolute desperation breeds a very specific type of reckless ingenuity. Brandon realized he had one single remaining asset left to his name. It was his own identity and a desperate willingness to accept incredibly predatory interest rates. He walked aimlessly down the street until he found a small, rundown internet cafe tucked between two souvenir shops. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale coffee and cheap cigarettes. It was a staggering contrast to the pristine marble lobby he had occupied just an hour earlier. He sat down at an unsecured public computer terminal and frantically began searching for high-risk international payday loans. He typed his personal social security number into sketchy web portals, hoping someone would approve a rapid cash advance. He leveraged the absolute last tiny shred of his personal credit score to borrow just enough money for 2 economy-class airline tickets back to the United States. The digital lender forced him to agree to an astronomical interest rate that would financially ruin him, even if he had a successful company to return to. But Brandon did not care about the long-term financial consequences. He only cared about immediate physical survival and escaping the profound public humiliation of his current reality. The screen finally flashed green, confirming the predatory loan had been approved and the funds were available for immediate ticketing. He purchased the absolute cheapest seats available on a crowded red-eye flight departing later that same evening. They would be sitting in cramped, uncomfortable chairs near the loud bathrooms, without any luggage or basic dignity. Madison sat on a plastic chair beside him in the dingy cafe, weeping bitterly. She was completely devastated by her sudden, violent descent into poverty and the loss of her expensive wardrobe. But Brandon was not crying. His initial shock and panic had rapidly mutated into a blind, furious rage directed entirely at me. He refused to accept any personal responsibility for his actions. Instead, he convinced himself that I had completely lost my mind due to the severe head trauma from the highway accident. He rationalized to Madison that my aggressive financial actions were the direct result of a severe medical delirium. He formulated a desperate, dangerous plan in his mind as he stared at the digital boarding passes. He would fly back to the city under the cover of darkness. He would take a cheap taxi directly to my house and burst aggressively through my front door. He fully intended to physically corner me in my medical bed and forcefully demand that I sign a complete transfer of power over the estate and the company. He honestly believed he could intimidate a crippled old man into surrendering everything simply by raising his voice and using his physical presence. He thought he could bully his way back into a life of luxury. He did not realize that the subservient, enabling father he had left in the hospital room no longer existed. He did not know that he was flying straight into a carefully constructed legal fortress. He was walking blindly into a steel trap that would sever his ties to my legacy forever. The digital alerts from the corporate banking server confirmed that the financial lockdown was complete, but I knew my son well enough to predict his immediate physical reaction. A cornered animal does not simply surrender, and Brandon had spent his entire life believing that aggression could solve any problem he created. I knew he was currently boarding a cheap commercial flight back to the city, fueled by sheer desperation and a deeply misplaced sense of authority. He would land in the middle of the night and come directly to my home expecting to find a weak, medicated old man he could easily terrorize into submission. I looked around my quiet study and realized that the final phase of my silent adjustment required turning my sanctuary into an impenetrable fortress. I turned to Aaron Foster and instructed him to leave the house. His legal work for the day was finished, and I needed to handle the upcoming physical confrontation entirely on my own terms. Aaron packed his heavy leather briefcase and offered a rare nod of genuine respect before walking out the front door. Once the house was completely empty, except for Nurse Diana and myself, I initiated the immediate total lockdown of my property. I opened the master administrative panel on my tablet and navigated to the residential security system. 5 years ago, when Brandon first moved out, I had installed top-tier digital smart locks on every single exterior door. I had given him and Madison master digital access codes, telling myself it was for emergency medical situations. In reality, it was just another boundary I had failed to enforce. I highlighted their digital profiles on the glowing screen. With 2 deliberate taps, I permanently deleted their access credentials from the central server. The heavy deadbolts on the front door. The side garage entrance and the back patio instantly engaged with a loud synchronized mechanical click. The physical perimeter was officially sealed. They could no longer walk freely into my life whenever it suited their selfish needs. The digital erasure was profoundly satisfying, but I knew a locked door would not stop a desperate man who felt entitled to the entire kingdom. I wheeled my medical chair out of the study and down the long hardwood hallway toward the living room. Nurse Diana followed closely behind me, watching my movements with quiet professional vigilance. I stopped in front of the massive cherry wood display cabinet that had already been violated by Madison and her illegal appraisers. The empty velvet shelves where the silver teapots of my wife once rested felt like open physical wounds in the quiet room. I refused to let them steal another single memory from my home. I asked Diana to help me secure the remaining physical legacy of my late wife. I had already contacted a premium secure transport service an hour earlier. They were not the fraudulent company Madison had hired to steal the grand piano. These were highly bonded private security couriers who specialized in moving priceless museum artifacts directly into subterranean bank vaults. The heavy armored transport truck arrived exactly 30 minutes later. 2 large men wearing dark tactical uniforms and carrying reinforced steel transit cases stepped into my living room. I sat in my wheelchair and personally supervised every single movement they made. I instructed them to carefully wrap the remaining antique porcelain vases, the delicate crystal stemware, and the heavy silver serving platters. I watched as they securely packed away the beautiful artifacts my wife had spent decades collecting. It was a heartbreaking process to watch my home being systematically stripped of its warmth and history. But I knew it was absolutely necessary. I was removing every single piece of leverage my son might attempt to use against me. Once the glass display cabinet was completely empty, the couriers sealed the steel transit cases and carried them out to the armored truck. The heavy metal doors of the vehicle slammed shut, echoing loudly across the quiet winter neighborhood. The truck drove away, carrying my most precious physical memories to a heavily guarded underground vault downtown. They would remain there, safe and untouchable, until the impending war was entirely concluded. The sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the empty living room. The large house felt incredibly hollow, without the gleam of antique silver reflecting the evening light. But it also felt completely secure. There was nothing left for them to steal. There was nothing left for them to break. The grand mahogany piano still sat in the corner of the room, but it was far too heavy for Brandon to move on his own. It would serve as the perfect silent witness to his final defeat. I asked Diana to prepare a strong pot of black coffee and a light dinner. I knew I would not be sleeping tonight. I needed my mind sharp and my senses completely alert. The heavy painkillers prescribed by the hospital were making me slightly drowsy, so I instructed my nurse to cut the evening dosage in half. I was willing to endure the sharp, throbbing pain in my shattered femur if it meant I could face my son with absolute mental clarity. The winter night settled heavily over the estate. The temperature outside plummeted, freezing the damp pavement into sheets of black ice. It was the exact same dangerous weather that had nearly claimed my life just 3 days ago. The poetic justice of the approaching storm was not lost on me. I wheeled my chair back into the study and positioned myself directly behind my heavy wooden desk. I turned off the overhead lights, leaving only the small brass reading lamp illuminated. The soft, warm glow cast deep shadows across my face. I placed the thick folders of forensic financial evidence directly in the center of the desk. I laid the drafted police report for grand larceny right next to the corporate audit documents. Everything was perfectly aligned. The legal guillotine was primed and ready to drop. I sat in the quiet darkness, listening to the wind howl against the window panes. I reflected on the small, innocent boy who used to play on these very hardwood floors and mourned the cruel stranger he had chosen to become. I was no longer a victim trapped in a hospital bed begging for basic human compassion. I was the architect of their destruction, and I was completely ready for them to come home. The weather broke violently just after midnight. A massive winter thunderstorm rolled across the city, bringing freezing rain and deafening cracks of thunder. It was a flawless, terrifying replica of the exact weather system that had nearly taken my life on the highway just a few days prior. I sat in the dim light of my study, listening to the heavy drops of icy water hammering against the reinforced glass windows. A cheap yellow taxi pulled up to the iron gates of my driveway. The vehicle idled for a moment before speeding away into the dark night. The headlights cut through the driving rain, illuminating two miserable figures trudging up the long walkway toward the porch. Brandon and Madison had finally arrived. They were completely soaked to the bone, wearing the thin, bright cotton resort clothing they had packed specifically for the Mexican sun. They dragged themselves up the front porch steps, shivering uncontrollably as the freezing wind whipped around them. Brandon marched directly to the heavy oak front door and punched his master access code into the digital keypad. The small screen flashed a solid red light, emitting a sharp, negative electronic tone. He punched the numbers again, pressing his cold, shaking fingers violently against the glass surface. The lock remained completely unresponsive. He grabbed the heavy brass door handle and pulled with all of his remaining physical strength. The heavy deadbolt held firm against his weight. He began pounding his bare fists against the thick wood, shouting my name into the howling wind. Madison stood behind him, wrapping her arms around her thin frame, screaming about the freezing cold and demanding he get them inside. The digital barricade I had erected earlier that evening was performing flawlessly. Brandon refused to accept defeat. His sheer desperation completely overrode his basic common sense and any remaining shred of human decency. He stepped off the covered porch and waded through the freezing mud toward the side of the house. He dragged Madison along by the wrist, completely ignoring her loud, frantic protests about her ruined designer shoes and her freezing skin. They moved toward the narrow brick alleyway that led to the kitchen entrance. Brandon knew there was a small decorative glass window positioned right above the side door latch. He looked around the dark patio and picked up a heavy cast-iron lawn ornament from my garden. Without a single moment of hesitation, he swung the heavy metal statue directly into the glass pane. The window shattered instantly, raining sharp, jagged shards of thick glass across the kitchen tile inside. The sound of the breaking glass was completely swallowed by a massive clap of thunder overhead. I had intentionally deactivated the perimeter glass break sensors from my tablet 30 minutes earlier. I wanted them to breach the house. I wanted them to cross that final, undeniable legal threshold. He reached his bleeding arm through the broken opening and manually disengaged the interior deadbolt. He forced the side door open and stumbled into the dark house. Madison followed closely behind him, carefully stepping over the broken glass and shivering violently from the freezing rain. They had officially crossed the line from entitled family members to active criminal trespassers. They were actively breaking and entering into my private residence in the middle of the night. Brandon did not try to hide his physical presence inside the house. He wanted me to hear him coming. He wanted to project dominance. He stomped heavily through the dark kitchen, leaving wet, muddy footprints across the pristine hardwood floors. He began shouting at the top of his lungs, demanding that I come out of my bedroom immediately. His voice echoed harshly down the long, quiet hallways, cutting through the silence of the large, empty house. He screamed that I had completely lost my mind and that he was going to have me committed to a psychiatric facility for elder abuse the very next morning. He demanded to know why his monthly allowance was missing from his personal account. He shrieked about the humiliating, terrifying ordeal at the luxury resort and the degrading, cheap commercial flight he had been forced to endure sitting in the very back of the plane. He loudly announced that he was absolutely not leaving this house until I unlocked his corporate bank accounts and wired $50,000 to his personal checking account to compensate for his immense emotional distress. He sounded exactly like a feral animal trapped in a cage of his own making. He stormed through the empty living room, completely failing to notice that the massive cherry wood display cabinet was entirely devoid of my late wife's silver collection. His vision was completely blinded by his own furious, boundless greed. He marched directly toward the closed, heavy oak door of my private study, fully intending to kick it open and terrorize me into absolute submission. He grabbed the brass knob and shoved the heavy door open with his shoulder, using his entire body weight. He stormed into the room, pointing his finger aggressively forward and opening his mouth to scream another vicious threat. The harsh words died instantly in his throat. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring in absolute shock at the scene unfolding before him. The study was not the quiet, vulnerable medical recovery room he had expected to find. It was a heavily fortified tactical command center. I sat perfectly upright in my customized medical wheelchair, positioned directly behind my heavy mahogany desk. I was dressed in a crisp white button-down shirt and a dark tailored blazer, completely defying the pathetic image of a weak, bedridden patient he had left in the hospital. I did not look afraid. I did not look confused. I looked at him with absolute cold contempt. My attorney, Aaron Foster, sat calmly to my right, wearing his pristine charcoal suit, and reviewing a stack of printed legal documents under the warm brass reading lamp. He did not even bother to look up when Brandon violently breached the room. He simply turned a page with a quiet rustle of paper. But the most terrifying element of the room stood silently in the deep shadows directly behind my desk. Two massive private security contractors, wearing dark tactical uniforms and heavy utility belts, stood perfectly still with their arms crossed over their massive chests. They were highly trained professionals explicitly hired to protect my physical safety and enforce my boundaries. The aggressive, furious momentum Brandon had carried through the entire house evaporated in a single terrifying heartbeat. His wet clothes suddenly clung to him like a freezing second skin. The blood from his freshly cut arm dripped slowly onto my expensive Persian rug. Madison stepped into the doorway behind him and gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. She looked frantically around the room, realizing instantly that they had walked directly into an ambush. Brandon realized he was not the powerful, untouchable predator in this scenario. He was simply a foolish, desperate, broke man who had just violently broken into the heavily guarded fortress of the person who legally owned his entire life. The steel trap had finally snapped completely shut. The freezing rain continued to hammer against the exterior of the house, creating a deafening roar that perfectly matched the chaos unfolding inside my study. Brandon stood frozen for only a moment, before his sheer arrogance completely overrode his temporary fear. He stepped forward, his wet shoes squeaking loudly against the hardwood floor. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and began to scream at the top of his lungs. He did not ask how my shattered leg was healing or if the severe pain had subsided. He did not offer a single word of apology for violently smashing a window and breaking into my home in the middle of the night. Instead, he launched into a vicious, completely unhinged tirade about his ruined luxury vacation. He described the absolute humiliation of being locked out of his penthouse suite in front of other wealthy guests. He yelled about the degrading, terrifying experience of flying on a cheap commercial airline surrounded by crying children and the horrific smell of the crowded economy cabin. He blamed me entirely for his misery and his public embarrassment. He demanded that I pick up my phone right that very second and order the international bank to unlock his corporate accounts. He shouted that I had absolutely no right to interfere with his daily business operations. He claimed he was a brilliant chief executive officer, and I was just an ignorant old man who did not understand the complex nature of modern logistics finance. Madison stepped out from behind him, her teeth chattering violently from the freezing rain that soaked her thin designer clothes. She wrapped her wet arms around herself and glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She completely ignored the two massive security contractors standing quietly in the deep shadows of the room. She marched up to the edge of my desk and demanded that I give her the combination code to the heavy steel safe hidden in my master bedroom closet. She shrieked that her expensive designer luggage and her custom jewelry had been confiscated by the Mexican resort authorities. She stated that she needed $20,000 in cash immediately to replace her stolen wardrobe and compensate for the severe emotional trauma I had maliciously inflicted upon them. They stood in my quiet study, dripping freezing, muddy rainwater onto my expensive Persian rug, acting as if they were royalty, demanding immediate tribute from a disobedient servant. Their staggering lack of self-awareness was a terrifying thing to witness. I did not raise my voice to match their frantic screaming. I did not offer a single word of defense or explanation for my actions. I simply sat perfectly still in my medical wheelchair and watched them with the cold, detached observation of a scientist studying a completely predictable insect. The two private security contractors stepped out of the shadows and moved perfectly in sync to flank my heavy mahogany desk. They did not draw weapons or make any verbal threats. Their sheer physical size and their highly disciplined silence were more than enough to force Brandon to take a sudden, terrified step backward. The loud, arrogant shouting abruptly died in his throat, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the room. I slowly turned my head and gave my attorney, Aaron Foster, a single deliberate nod. Aaron did not speak a single word to my son. He simply reached out with his long, pale fingers and selected the thinnest manila folder from the perfectly aligned stack on the desk. He pushed it slowly across the polished wood surface until it stopped directly in front of Brandon. Aaron leaned back in his expensive leather chair, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, and waited with absolute predatory patience. Brandon hesitated for a long moment, his panicked eyes darting between the closed folder and the intimidating security guards. He finally reached out with a trembling hand and flipped the heavy paper cover open. The first page was a simple, certified banking statement printed on crisp white paper from my primary financial institution. It contained exactly one highlighted line of black text. It was the formal, irrevocable cancellation of the $3,000 automatic monthly transfer that had funded his lavish lifestyle for his entire adult life. Brandon stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing repeatedly without producing any sound. He looked up at me, his face pale and completely contorted with deep confusion. He stammered that this was completely illegal and that I owed him that money because he was my only son, and he relied on that income to survive. I looked him directly in the eye and told him that my financial support was a privilege born from deep paternal love, not a mandatory tax extracted by a greedy parasite. I informed him that the exact moment he told me his luxury vacation was more important than my physical survival. He had voluntarily resigned from the position of my son. The monthly allowance was gone forever, and there was absolutely no appeals process available to him. Before Brandon could fully process the permanent loss of his personal financial safety net, Aaron Foster reached for the second folder resting on the desk. This folder was significantly thicker and carried a heavy red confidential seal stamped boldly across the front cover. Aaron slid it smoothly across the mahogany wood, positioning it directly in front of Madison. She flinched violently as the folder stopped near her trembling hands. She looked at Brandon for support, but he was still staring blankly at his own canceled bank statement, completely lost in his own personal ruin. Madison slowly reached down and opened the cover. The very first item inside was a thick stack of high-resolution glossy photographs printed directly from my hidden home security cameras. The digital images were undeniably clear and perfectly time-stamped. They showed Madison standing in my living room, holding the front door wide open for the illegal appraisers. The consecutive photographs documented every single moment of the theft. They showed the men carefully wrapping my late wife Beatrice's precious silver teapots and the rare imported porcelain vases. Madison physically recoiled from the desk, dropping the glossy photographs onto the floor, as if they had physically burned her fingers. She began to stammer rapidly, claiming it was a massive, terrible misunderstanding, and that she was simply having the pieces professionally appraised for updated insurance purposes. Aaron did not let her finish her pathetic, desperate lie. He calmly reached across the desk and tapped a specific document resting deep inside the folder. It was the heavily detailed commercial wire transfer receipt, proving beyond any doubt that she had accepted $18,000 from the exclusive private auction house downtown. Directly beneath that receipt was the digital logistics contract she had illegally authorized, using my forged signature to transport Beatrice's vintage grand piano the following week. Madison stopped talking instantly. All the color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a wet, freezing ghost. Aaron informed her in a quiet, terrifying voice that the final document in that folder was a fully drafted criminal police report. He explained that it detailed multiple severe felony charges, including grand larceny wire fraud and the criminal forgery of a financial instrument. He stated very clearly that the police report had not yet been formally filed with the local authorities, but it was fully prepared and waiting for my final command. Madison collapsed onto her knees on the expensive rug, sobbing uncontrollably and begging me to forgive her terrible mistake. She swore she would return the custom diamond jewelry she bought and cancel her upcoming mountain wellness retreat. I looked down at her kneeling on the floor and felt absolutely nothing but cold disgust. I told her that she had treated my beloved home like a discount retail warehouse and tried to sell the very soul of my late wife just to buy a tennis bracelet. I told her she would be leaving my house tonight with absolutely nothing but the wet clothes on her back and the terrifying knowledge that I held the absolute keys to her future prison cell. The complete total destruction of Madison's arrogance left Brandon standing entirely alone in the center of the room. He looked down at his weeping wife and then back at me, his eyes wide with genuine, absolute terror. He finally realized that the old, vulnerable, injured man he had abandoned in the hospital was entirely gone. He was facing a ruthless, calculating adversary who had spent the last 3 days systematically dismantling every single pillar of his fraudulent existence. Aaron Foster leaned forward and placed his hand firmly on the third and final folder. It was the thickest, heaviest document on the desk, binding hundreds of pages of complex financial data into a single lethal weapon. Aaron pushed it slowly across the wood. It slid with a heavy, authoritative sound, coming to rest directly over the canceled bank statement Brandon had dropped earlier. Brandon did not want to open it. His hands were shaking violently, and his breath was coming in short, rapid, shallow gasps. Aaron instructed him in a firm, unyielding tone to open the file and read the executive summary printed on the very first page. Brandon forced himself to lift the heavy cover. His eyes scanned the dense legal text and the brightly highlighted accounting figures. It was the comprehensive emergency corporate audit I had authorized earlier that afternoon. The documents provided undeniable, irrefutable proof that Brandon had been actively and continuously embezzling massive sums of capital from the logistics software startup. The financial ledgers highlighted his illegal use of corporate funds to pay for private jets, exclusive beach resorts, and luxury vehicles he had absolutely no legal right to purchase. The audit explicitly detailed his severe breach of fiduciary duty and his total complete failure to maintain basic operational solvency for the company. Aaron spoke with the cold, mechanical precision of a judge delivering a final, devastating verdict. He explained that as the 51% majority shareholder, I possessed the absolute legal authority to protect my initial investment from gross managerial negligence and criminal theft. He pointed a long finger to the very last page of the executive summary. It was an official, legally binding corporate decree bearing my newly notarized signature. It declared the immediate permanent termination of Brandon as the chief executive officer of the company he founded. Furthermore, it officially authorized the complete liquidation of the entire corporate entity to recoup my initial $2 million seed investment and pay the outstanding vendor debts. Brandon dropped the heavy folder. The thick stack of papers spilled across the floor, mixing with the security photographs of his wife committing a felony. His entire world had just violently evaporated into thin air. His company was gone. His professional reputation was completely, permanently destroyed. The board of directors would receive the full audit results by morning, and the furious wealthy investors would immediately file massive civil lawsuits to recover their stolen money. Brandon fell backwards, stumbling clumsily until his back hit the heavy wooden bookshelf lining the wall of the study. He slid down the polished wood paneling until he was sitting on the floor right next to his sobbing wife. They were two broken, ruined people sitting in a puddle of freezing, muddy rainwater and shattered dreams. They had walked into my home expecting to conquer a weak old man and walk away with endless wealth. Instead, they had walked directly into a perfectly executed legal execution. Brandon looked up at me with hot tears streaming down his face. He finally asked me why I was doing this to him. He pleaded with me, saying that I was completely destroying his entire life and that he would be entirely destitute and homeless. I leaned forward in my medical wheelchair, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany desk. I looked at the son I had loved and protected for over 3 decades and delivered the final absolute truth of the night. I told him that I was not destroying his life at all. I was simply holding up a highly polished mirror to the massive destruction he had already caused on his own. I reminded him of the cold, sterile hospital room, the agonizing pain of my shattered leg, and the terrifying reality of my accident. I reminded him of the exact cruel words he spoke before he walked out the door to catch his first-class flight. I told him that he had made a very clear, conscious choice that day. He chose temporary, superficial luxury over deep familial loyalty. He chose his own immediate comfort over my basic physical survival. I explained that actions have severe, inescapable consequences in the real adult world. He had spent his entire life insulated from those harsh consequences by my endless financial generosity and blind love. I told him that my generosity had officially run completely dry. I was not angry anymore. I was simply making a silent, necessary adjustment to the reality he had personally created. I instructed him to look down at the 3 folders scattered across the floor. I told him that those documents were his entirely new reality. He was a broke, unemployed man facing massive civil litigation, and his wife was facing imminent felony charges for grand larceny. The massive trap had completely snapped shut, breaking every bone of their entitlement. I sat back in my chair and looked at the 2 massive security contractors waiting quietly in the shadows. I told Brandon that the corporate audit was entirely complete, and his final meeting in my home was officially over. The absolute finality of the corporate decree rested heavily on the polished wood floor. Brandon stared at my freshly notarized signature. It was the exact same signature that had generously funded his entire existence since the day he was born, and now it was the signature that condemned him to federal prison. The arrogant delusion that he was a brilliant self-made entrepreneur evaporated entirely into the cold air of the study. He finally understood the terrifying scope of his immediate future. He was not just a disgraced executive facing a ruined company and public humiliation. He was a common criminal who had committed severe wire fraud and gross corporate embezzlement. The federal authorities would inevitably seize his personal assets to satisfy the furious wealthy investors he had defrauded. His leased luxury cars, his expensive designer watches, and his high-end condominium would all be rapidly auctioned off to pay for his massive fraudulent debts. The suffocating, crushing weight of this new reality squeezed the remaining defiance right out of his chest, leaving him completely hollow. His wet knees hit the expensive Persian rug with a dull, heavy thud. He crawled forward completely, ignoring the freezing mud and rainwater soaking into his thin resort clothing. He reached out with trembling, frantic hands, trying to grasp the metal footrests of my customized medical wheelchair. The 2 massive security contractors immediately stepped forward to intercept him, but I raised a single hand to halt their movement. I wanted to hear exactly what my son sounded like when his profound arrogance was entirely stripped away. He looked up at me with a face completely distorted by sheer animal panic. He begged me to reach down and tear up the corporate audit. He pleaded with me using the language of family and blood, claiming that a father could never send his own flesh and blood to a brutal federal penitentiary. He wept loudly, his voice cracking, as he promised that he would work every single day for the rest of his natural life to pay back the stolen corporate capital if I just gave him one more chance to fix his terrible mistakes. I looked down at his tear-stained face and felt a profound, chilling emptiness where my unconditional love used to reside. I did not feel the protective paternal instinct that had governed every single decision of my entire adult life. That instinct had died permanently on a cold highway surrounded by shattered glass and twisted metal while he was busy packing for a tropical vacation. I leaned slightly forward and looked directly into his panicked, searching eyes. I spoke with a quiet, unyielding authority that filled every corner of the silent room. I told him that he had made his final choice regarding our family when he stood over my hospital bed and complained about a minor parking fee. I told him that he was the one who voluntarily severed our bond so he could fly to a beautiful beach while I was left broken, bleeding, and entirely alone. I looked at the devastating legal documents scattered across the floor between us. I stated clearly that he had disowned me when my survival was inconvenient to his schedule. I was simply formalizing the paperwork to match his ultimate decision. I told him he was no longer my son, he was just a financial liability I was legally liquidating. Brandon opened his mouth to scream another desperate, pathetic plea, but I did not give him the opportunity to speak another word in my home. I turned my head and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the two security contractors waiting silently in the shadows. They moved with terrifying professional efficiency and overwhelming force. They grabbed Brandon by his wet, shivering shoulders and hauled him forcefully to his feet. He thrashed and kicked violently, screaming my name and begging for mercy, but his frantic struggles were completely useless against their massive physical strength. Aaron Foster calmly opened the study door as a third private contractor emerged from the hallway and firmly grabbed Madison by her arm. She did not fight back or offer a single word of protest. She was completely paralyzed by the terrifying realization of her impending felony charges for stealing my late wife's silver collection. They dragged my former son and my former daughter-in-law out of my study and down the long, dark hallway. They marched them right past the empty cherry wood display cabinet and directly through the kitchen where the shattered glass from the broken window still covered the tile floor. The heavy side door was shoved violently open, letting the freezing rain and the howling winter wind rush back into the warmth of the house. The security guards physically threw them out onto the dark, freezing lawn without a shred of hesitation or gentle care. I wheeled my medical chair slowly toward the broken kitchen window and watched the final brutal consequence of their greed unfold in the mud. Brandon stumbled clumsily and fell face first into the freezing dirt. He reached a trembling hand out toward his wife, desperately seeking comfort and solidarity in the absolute ruin of their lives. Madison did not reach back to help him up. She looked down at him with a face twisted into pure, vicious hatred. The grand illusion of their perfect, wealthy marriage shattered instantly in the cold, driving rain. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, striking his chest repeatedly with her closed fists. She shrieked that he had promised her endless wealth and a life of untouchable luxury. She cursed him for losing his entire company and failing completely to secure my valuable estate. She screamed that she was leaving him immediately and finding her own aggressive lawyer to protect herself from his criminal fraud. They tore each other apart in the freezing mud, entirely consumed by the toxic greed that had brought them to my door. I watched them destroy each other for one long moment before I turned my wheelchair around and left them to the storm. 2 weeks passed since the violent storm and the final confrontation in my study. The harsh winter weather had softened into a crisp, bright morning. I navigated my customized wheelchair through the polished brass doors of the most exclusive private auction house in the city center. Nurse Diana pushed my chair with quiet grace. Aaron Foster walked beside us holding his signature black leather briefcase. We were not there to bid on expensive art or rare antiques. We were there to witness the final reclamation of my late wife's physical legacy. The grand exhibition hall was filled with wealthy collectors, aggressive art dealers, and curious socialites. They held numbered paddles and whispered among themselves, anticipating the sale of highly coveted items. In the very center of the elevated stage sat Beatrice's vintage mahogany grand piano. The beautiful, polished wood gleamed under the heavy theatrical lighting. It looked magnificent and profoundly out of place, surrounded by greedy strangers seeking to purchase a trophy. The head auctioneer stepped up to the wooden podium and adjusted his microphone. He announced the piano as the premier lot of the morning session. He described its flawless acoustic condition and its rich history. He expected a fierce bidding war that would drive the final price into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. He did not know that the war had already been won before he even opened his mouth. Before the auctioneer could ask the audience for the opening bid, Aaron Foster raised his hand. He did not hold a numbered paddle. He held a thick legal injunction bearing a prominent federal seal. Aaron walked calmly up the short steps to the podium and handed the document directly to the stunned auctioneer. The large exhibition room fell into an absolute heavy silence. I wheeled my chair forward to the very front row, stopping just below the elevated stage. I looked up at the beautiful instrument my wife had loved so deeply. I spoke clearly, projecting my voice across the quiet room, so every single wealthy collector could hear the absolute truth. I announced that the piano was no longer available for private purchase. I explained that it had been illegally consigned by a family member currently facing severe felony charges for grand larceny. The auctioneer stepped back from the podium, wiping a nervous bead of sweat from his forehead. He quickly reviewed the federal injunction and nodded his head in complete submission. I turned my attention to the director of the City Music Academy, who was sitting quietly in the back row at my personal invitation. I formally transferred the full legal ownership of the grand piano to his educational institution. I mandated through strict legal covenants that it must be placed in their main performance hall and dedicated entirely to the memory of Beatrice Pierce. The piano would be played by gifted young students who possessed genuine passion rather than superficial wealth. I watched the academy director step forward and touch the polished mahogany wood with deep, genuine reverence. A profound peace finally settled over my battered heart. The absolute center of my home had not been sold to the highest bidder to fund a designer wardrobe. It had been given a new, eternal life filled with beautiful music and absolute respect. While I was securing my wife's beautiful legacy downtown, my former son was experiencing the final devastating shockwave of his own destruction across the city. Brandon was sitting alone on the expensive imported leather sofa inside his luxury high-rise condominium. He was staring blankly at his dead laptop screen. The past 2 weeks had been an absolute living nightmare for him. The reality of his complete financial annihilation had set in with terrifying speed. His logistics software company was currently in the final stages of aggressive federal liquidation. His furious wealthy investors had successfully frozen his few remaining personal bank accounts through massive civil lawsuits. Madison had quickly packed her remaining designer bags and moved back into her mother's cramped apartment. She had officially filed for divorce just 3 days after the disastrous confrontation in my study, desperately trying to distance herself from his impending federal fraud charges. Brandon was completely, entirely alone. He believed that despite the absolute ruin of his professional life, he still possessed a multi-million-dollar penthouse overlooking the city skyline. He thought he had a safe, comfortable fortress to hide inside while the massive legal storm raged outside his windows. He was entirely wrong. A series of loud, authoritative knocks suddenly echoed through his quiet apartment. The sharp sound made him jump. Brandon dragged himself off the sofa and walked slowly to the heavy steel front door. He looked through the security peephole and saw 2 large uniformed process servers standing in the carpeted hallway alongside the building manager. He opened the door slowly, feeling a fresh wave of sheer panic rising tightly in his chest. The lead process server did not offer a polite greeting or ask for his name. He simply thrust a thick stack of legal documents directly into Brandon's chest. Brandon stumbled backward clumsily, clutching the heavy papers against his shirt. He looked down at the bold black lettering printed on the front page. It was an immediate notice of eviction and a formal termination of residential tenancy. Brandon frantically read the dense legal text, his mind struggling to comprehend how he could possibly be evicted from his own home. He had completely forgotten the foundational reality of his entire wealthy lifestyle. 7 years ago, when he first demanded to live in the most exclusive luxury building in the financial district, his personal credit score and his actual verifiable income were entirely insufficient. He had begged me to co-sign the massive lease agreement and provide the substantial financial backing required by the elite property management group. I had agreed to sign the paperwork, assuming he would eventually refinance the property solely in his own name once his software company became highly successful. His profound laziness and his deep unearned arrogance had prevented him from ever completing that basic financial task. I had remained the primary legal guarantor of the property for 7 years. The previous afternoon, I had simply contacted the property management group and formally withdrawn my financial guarantee. I provided them with the legal documentation proving my son was currently under federal investigation for gross corporate embezzlement. Because Brandon currently possessed absolutely zero verifiable income, and his bank accounts were entirely frozen by federal courts, the management group immediately terminated the lease agreement to protect their own liabilities. The building manager stepped into the doorway and looked at Brandon with thinly veiled disgust. He informed my former son that the eviction order was legally effective immediately. He stated that the building security team was already waiting down in the main lobby. Brandon had exactly 2 hours to pack a single suitcase of his personal clothing and vacate the premises voluntarily. If he failed to leave the building within the allotted time, the local police would be called to physically remove him for criminal trespassing. Brandon dropped the heavy legal papers onto the expensive hardwood floor. He looked around the massive, beautiful apartment that he had never actually earned or paid for with his own money. The panoramic view of the city skyline shining brightly through the floor-to-ceiling windows suddenly felt like a massive, cruel joke. The absolute final pillar of his unearned wealth had just completely collapsed underneath his feet. He was completely broke, facing severe federal prison time, going through a bitter divorce, and now he was entirely homeless. He had traded his loyal father for a luxury vacation, and the final devastating bill had just arrived. The grueling physical therapy sessions had become the new focal point of my daily routine. 3 afternoons a week, I pushed my shattered body to its absolute limits inside a sterile, brightly lit rehabilitation center across town. The heavy steel traction halo had finally been surgically removed from my leg just a few days prior. It was replaced by a rigid, specialized walking brace that allowed me to take my very first agonizing steps with the heavy reliance on an aluminum cane. The physical pain was sharp and constant, but it was a productive, necessary pain. It was the undeniable sensation of rebuilding a broken foundation. Nurse Diana Cole remained by my side during every single strenuous appointment, offering quiet encouragement and professional stability. We exited the warm glass double doors of the clinic and stepped out into the crisp, biting air of the late winter afternoon. I pulled my heavy wool coat tighter against my chest, preparing for the slow, careful walk toward the modified passenger van parked in the handicap loading zone. Before we could reach the edge of the concrete sidewalk, a dark figure stepped out from behind a large concrete pillar. My protective instincts immediately flared, but Nurse Diana simply placed a calm, steadying hand on my shoulder. The man standing directly in our path was barely recognizable as the arrogant chief executive officer who had violently breached my home just a few weeks ago. It was Brandon. He looked completely hollowed out by the sheer, terrifying velocity of his own downfall. His posture was severely stooped, and his face was covered in a thick, uneven layer of dark stubble. The pristine, custom-tailored suits and the expensive, imported linen resort wear were completely gone. He was wearing a deeply wrinkled synthetic jacket that looked entirely inadequate for the freezing afternoon wind. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, surrounded by deep, dark purple circles that spoke of endless, sleepless nights. He looked exactly like a desperate, broken man who had just collided with the unforgiving, concrete wall of reality. He did not approach me with his usual arrogant stride. He shuffled forward nervously, wringing his bare, freezing hands together. He stopped a few feet away from my aluminum cane, completely respecting the silent physical boundary established by Diana. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice cracked horribly in the cold air. He swallowed hard and finally forced the desperate words past his lips. He told me that he had been officially locked out of his luxury penthouse condominium 2 days ago. He confessed that Madison had completely drained their remaining joint checking account before officially serving him with divorce papers. He admitted that he was currently sleeping on a stained mattress in a cheap roadside motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. He looked down at the icy pavement, completely unable to meet my direct gaze. He whispered that his motel money would completely run out by tomorrow morning, and he had absolutely nowhere else to go. His former wealthy friends had entirely abandoned him the exact moment the federal fraud investigation became public knowledge. He looked back up at me with tears welling in his bloodshot eyes. He did not demand a massive corporate bailout or a return to his lavish monthly allowance. He simply begged for 1 single month of basic rent money so he could figure out his next move. He stood there shivering in the winter wind, waiting for the familiar warmth of my paternal guilt to wash over him. He was relying on the decades of unconditional financial rescue I had always provided. I looked at his desperate, tear-stained face and felt the profound, absolute stillness of my own heart. The silent adjustment was already complete. I did not feel a single trace of pity or anger. I slowly reached my free hand into the deep inner pocket of my wool coat. Brandon's eyes instantly widened with a desperate, fragile hope. He clearly expected me to pull out my leather checkbook or a thick stack of emergency cash. He leaned slightly forward, practically vibrating with the anticipation of his immediate financial salvation. I withdrew my hand and held out a single piece of crisp white printer paper that had been folded neatly in half. Brandon reached out with a trembling hand and took the paper. He unfolded it quickly, his eyes scanning the black text with frantic speed. The fragile hope completely drained from his face, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated despair. It was not a bank draft or a legally binding financial contract. It was a meticulously researched, comprehensive list of local municipal homeless shelters, charity food banks, and entry-level minimum wage job fairs operating within the city limits. I had instructed Aaron Foster to compile the document the previous afternoon specifically for this inevitable encounter. I looked directly into my son's devastated eyes and delivered the final undeniable truth of his new existence. I told him that his permanent luxury vacation was officially over. I stated with absolute cold clarity that it was finally time for him to work. Brandon let out a low, agonizing sob that was completely swallowed by the howling winter wind. He clutched the piece of paper against his chest as if it were a physical wound. He sank slowly to his knees on the freezing concrete sidewalk, entirely consumed by the overwhelming, crushing weight of his absolute ruin. I did not offer him a hand to help him up. I did not speak another word. Nurse Diana stepped forward and opened the heavy passenger door of the modified vehicle. I carefully maneuvered my rigid braced leg and settled into the comfortable leather seat. She closed the heavy door with a solid, definitive thud, completely cutting off the sound of his weeping. She walked around to the driver's side, started the engine, and pulled smoothly away from the curb. I sat quietly in the warm cabin, looking straight ahead at the road unfolding before me. I did not turn my head. I did not look into the rearview mirror. I left him kneeling on the frozen pavement, entirely alone to face the brutal reality he had so carefully constructed. 6 months passed since the freezing winter storm washed the last remaining traces of my son from my property. The bitter cold of that dark season had finally surrendered to the warm, bright sunlight of early summer. My physical recovery had been a long, grueling journey, but I had walked every single step of it on my own terms. The heavy medical walking brace had been permanently retired to the back of my closet. I now navigated the polished hardwood floors of my home using a thick, solid oak cane I had commissioned from a local craftsman. My right leg still ached when the weather turned damp, but the pain was no longer a terrifying reminder of my vulnerability. It was a quiet, steady testament to my survival. I walked through the quiet living room, pausing briefly near the empty corner where Beatrice's vintage mahogany piano used to sit. The space was no longer a painful void. It felt clean and entirely peaceful. The toxic, suffocating anxiety of constantly managing Brandon's manufactured crises had completely evaporated from my daily existence. I poured myself a cup of dark coffee and walked out onto the back patio, breathing in the sweet scent of the blooming garden. I was entirely alone, but for the very first time in decades, I did not feel lonely. The aggressive federal liquidation of the logistics software company had concluded exactly as Aaron Foster had predicted. My initial seed investment was successfully recovered from the corporate ashes and secured back into my primary retirement accounts. The steady $3,000 monthly transfers that had previously vanished into Brandon's black hole of luxury spending were now accumulating quietly in my savings. I spent many long evenings sitting in my study staring at the massive financial ledgers. I realized that unearned wealth had been the exact poison that destroyed my family. I had handed my son a golden kingdom without ever teaching him how to build the castle walls. I refused to let the remaining years of my life and the vast resources of my estate go to waste simply sitting in a dormant bank vault. I wanted my legacy to actively build something profoundly meaningful in the real world. I began to think very deeply about the people who had actually stood by my side during the darkest, most terrifying moments of my recovery. I did not think about blood relatives or legal heirs. I thought exclusively about Nurse Diana Cole. Diana had spent the last 6 months demonstrating the exact kind of relentless dedication and quiet integrity I had always desperately hoped to see in my own son. Through our daily conversations during my physical therapy, I had slowly learned the difficult truth about her personal life. She was working grueling 14-hour medical shifts and taking private nursing contracts just to survive the crushing weight of her massive student loans. She was simultaneously paying for her younger sister to attend community college and supporting an elderly mother who could no longer work. She never once complained about her heavy burdens. She never demanded a luxury vacation or felt entitled to a life of easy leisure. She simply woke up every single morning, put on her medical scrubs, and did the hard, necessary work of healing broken people. She was the absolute antithesis of the entitled monster I had raised. Watching her tireless, compassionate labor ignited a brilliant new purpose in my mind. I realized that there were hundreds of brilliant young medical professionals just like Diana struggling to survive in a world that rarely rewarded pure, honest work. I picked up my phone and called Aaron Foster to schedule one final major structural adjustment to my estate. Later that same week, I ordered a private car to take me to the administrative campus of the State Medical University. I walked proudly through the heavy glass doors of the administration building, leaning heavily on my oak cane but keeping my head held high. I was escorted directly into the sunlit boardroom of the nursing college dean. Aaron Foster was already waiting at the polished mahogany conference table with a neat stack of legal documents prepared. We were not there to initiate a hostile corporate audit or freeze a fraudulent bank account. We were not there to destroy anything. We were there to plant the seeds of a completely new legacy. I sat down at the table and reviewed the comprehensive endowment contract Aaron had drafted. I was officially establishing the Beatrice Pierce Memorial Scholarship Fund. I was redirecting the massive recovered corporate capital and the former monthly allowance into a permanent financial trust. The endowment was specifically designed to provide full tuition coverage and a generous living stipend for young, struggling nursing students who demonstrated severe financial need and exceptional clinical empathy. I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen and signed my name at the bottom of the final page. The dark ink flowed smoothly across the crisp white paper. The profound emotional weight of that single signature was entirely different from the destructive legal strikes I had executed 6 months ago. Signing the corporate freeze had been an act of necessary amputation. Signing this educational endowment was an act of absolute undeniable creation. I was taking the money that had previously funded designer resortwear and private jets and using it to build the next generation of dedicated medical healers. The university dean shook my hand with genuine tears in her eyes, thanking me for the massive opportunity I was providing to her students. I walked slowly out of the administration building and stood near the edge of the vibrant green campus courtyard. I watched dozens of young medical students hurrying between their science classes, carrying heavy textbooks and wearing their practical clinical scrubs. They looked exhausted, but their faces were bright with genuine purpose and determination. I knew that my wealth was finally serving a noble cause. I knew that long after I was gone, the money I had earned would continue to protect and support the kind of people who truly deserved it. I took a deep breath of the warm summer air, leaning comfortably against my oak cane. The deep, festering wounds inflicted by my family had finally scarred over, leaving behind a profound, unshakable peace. I had successfully, completely rewritten the final chapter of my life. The morning air was crisp and smelled faintly of blooming jasmine from the garden. I sat in the sturdy wooden rocking chair on my back porch, holding a warm ceramic mug of black coffee. The heavy oak cane rested quietly against the railing right beside me. My right leg stretched out comfortably before me, feeling the gentle, welcoming warmth of the early summer sun. The estate was completely silent, but it was no longer the suffocating, heavy silence of a lonely old man waiting for his ungrateful son to call. It was the vibrant, living silence of a home that had finally been cleansed of its profound toxicity. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee and opened the digital news application on my tablet. I did not search for his name actively anymore, but local financial news always had a way of finding the surface. I scrolled through the morning headlines and stopped on a brief municipal legal summary. It was a short, dry paragraph buried deep in the business section, detailing the upcoming proceedings in the federal bankruptcy court. There it was printed in plain black digital text. The total, complete dissolution of the logistics software startup and the absolute personal bankruptcy of its former chief executive officer. Brandon was scheduled to stand before a federal judge later this week and officially declare his absolute financial ruin. I stared at his name for a very long time. I searched my own heart, expecting to find a lingering trace of paternal grief or perhaps a dark spark of vindictive joy. I found absolutely neither. There was no joy in my eyes as I read the final consequence of his massive arrogance. I only felt a deep, profound, and unshakable peace. It was the quiet calm of a judge who had delivered a fair, necessary verdict and finally closed the heavy book on a very long trial. I turned my gaze away from the glowing screen and looked out across my expansive back garden. Near the edge of the property stood a massive ancient oak tree that Beatrice and I had planted the very first year we bought the house together. A few years ago, a severe fungal rot had infected one of its largest, heaviest branches. The sickness was spreading rapidly toward the trunk, threatening to poison the entire root system. The tree surgeon told me I had to make a painful choice. I could leave the branch attached out of sentimental attachment and watch the entire beautiful tree slowly die, or I could aggressively amputate the infected wood to save the core. I had authorized the deep, brutal cut. The tree had looked unbalanced and wounded for a long time, but eventually it healed. It grew new healthy leaves and its roots dug deeper into the rich soil. As I sat on my porch listening to the morning birds, I realized my family was exactly like that ancient oak tree. I had spent decades watering a rotten branch, hoping my unconditional love would somehow cure his deep selfishness. I had foolishly believed that if I just gave him enough money, enough protection, and enough blind support, he would eventually grow into a decent man. I had finally learned the hardest lesson of my entire life. You cannot heal a rot that refuses to acknowledge its own sickness. The only way to save the tree was to cut it away without a single drop of mercy. The concept of family is so often weaponized by those who intend to cause the most harm. We are taught from a very young age to believe that shared blood is an unbreakable contract, demanding endless forgiveness and infinite sacrifice. We are told that we must endure disrespect, cruelty, and abandonment simply because the person hurting us shares our last name. I completely reject that dangerous notion now. Family is not a right guaranteed by biology. It is a profound privilege. It is a sacred bond that must be actively earned and continuously maintained through mutual respect, genuine loyalty, and basic human decency. When those foundational pillars are violently destroyed, the contract is entirely void. Blood might explain where you came from, but it absolutely does not dictate who you are obligated to tolerate. I do not regret the harsh boundaries I finally erected. I do not regret the financial guillotine I dropped on his fraudulent empire, or the cold, rainy night I forced him out of my home. I protected my dignity, I protected my late wife's memory, and I secured a powerful new legacy that will actually benefit the world. The endowment for those young, struggling nurses will continue to grow and provide genuine healing long after I am gone. My wealth is finally doing exactly what it was always meant to do. I placed the tablet face down on the wooden table and took another slow, peaceful sip of my coffee. The sun climbed higher into the bright blue sky, warming the solid foundation of my home. My name is Calvin Pierce. I survived a devastating highway collision, and I survived the absolute betrayal of my only son. I stand before you today unbroken, unapologetic, and entirely free. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found strength in these words, please share your own experiences with setting unshakable boundaries in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of truth and resilience. Remember that it is never too late to reclaim your own life and write your own final chapter. The most profound lesson I learned from this ordeal is that endless financial generosity, without firm boundaries, does not create love. It creates toxic entitlement. We often confuse financial support with parental devotion, believing we can buy our children's character and loyalty. Instead, we insulate them from the very consequences they need to become responsible adults. True love sometimes requires the courage to say no, to completely cut the financial cord, and to let them face the reality of their own choices. Blood makes you relatives, but only mutual respect, empathy, and earned trust make you a true family. If this story resonated with you, hit the subscribe button and share it with anyone who needs the courage to set their own unshakable boundaries.